I'm delighted to be joined again by Jonathan MS Pearce. He needs no introduction. People will know he's one of my favorite regular guests on the channel. Today, we're going to be having a deep dive into Kursk and what is going on there. Jonathan, welcome back.
Hello, Jonathan. It's good to speak to you. It's an interesting time at the moment. There's so much discussion going on with analysts, big name analysts, newspapers, and people within Ukraine, whether they be military people or population, talking about is Kursk worth it? What about Pokrovsk? Is this all one versus the other? And I think people have generally, in mainstream media, can be guilty of this, got it slightly wrong. So I've got some nuanced views on that, some of which I've already explained to you to your audience in a previous video.
I think there's so many angles here where you find there are the odd analyst who will come out and say something perhaps more aligned with what you and I are thinking, but there seems to be an almost inbuilt bias to presume that Ukraine is this was nice enough, but they can't possibly succeed against the eternal, invincible, inexhaustible of Russia. There seems to be an inbuilt bias there to downweight whatever Ukraine is doing and upweight Russia's potential. Do you detect this coming through in some of the media analysis and professional analysts as well?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think I don't know if there's a business model built around doom, whether it's more clickbaity. Mainstream media these days are about online clicks. I don't think headlines in newspapers are going to sell newspapers, particularly like the print media itself is a sort of dying breed. So I wonder whether selling doom is easier than selling the complexity of reality. I think you can more easily talk about this in simplicity, where it's all bad for Ukraine and people buy into that, and that feeds those who want Ukraine to fail. And there's also, I don't know, we're not very good at dealing with greys. We're either black or white, and you're not really going to sell what's going on in Ukraine as everything's wonderful for Ukraine. And so it's easier to sell it as everything's going bad and, oh, woe is Ukraine, rather than the reality is that, oh, this is quite complex and actually there are real benefits here that need to be weighed against the challenges over here. And do you know what? We need to take a big picture, but actually that requires us to sit down and analyze this in different levels, from the micro to the macro. And can you do that in a short clickbaity news article? I don't know.
What's more dramatic than the idea that in the first time in 80 years, there is a foreign army on Russian soil biting off huge chunks of its territory, not as a percentage of the whole, but a significant amount of territory, 100 settlements. They are also taking out Russian energy infrastructure, and they're using Leopard tanks in Kursk. I mean, given the historic resonance, given the significance of this, one would have thought that this would be a newspaper's dream story to hype it up. But no, there seems to be a down weighting of the whole thing. I think you and I have a sense of the historical weight of this moment. Um, is it because they're still sort of pre-programmed, as it were, to fear Russia and assume Russia is going to be prevalent here? Or are these events, I mean, maybe their demographic is no longer interested in geopolitics. People are too sort of wound up in internal politics and the superficialities of woke politics or anti-woke politics.
I yes, all of that, but I think the significant point for me is that Ukraine had two choices: to attack into Russia or to plug those troops and that material somewhere else on the front line, such as Pokrovsk, or attack somewhere else, right? But only attacking into Kursk has would allow them some strategic implications, some strategic gains. Phillips O'Brien wrote a Substack just today, this morning, I think, that was really good, that talked about how the mainstream media don't really understand the difference between strategic, operational, and tactical. And that's really important. So just very quickly to explain, strategic is, what are your strategies for the whole war? What are you doing with this war? How are you operating on a kind of really macro scale? Operational is, say, the Prokrovsk region. What's going on there, or the Kursk region, right? Uh, how are you maintaining an attack there? What are all the implications with your force quality and quantity, and their force quality and quantity, and where they're coming from with this direction, that? Okay, and then tactical is about, well, how do we take that village? Let's go to this hill which overlooks that village, and that gives us the advantage there. So you've got these three different levels, and people, the mainstream media, keep talking about uh, places like Prokrovsk and Severodonetsk and Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar as being strategic cities or towns. And the reality is, as Phillips O'Brien says in this piece, they are not strategic. This is a bastardization of the term. And in fact, the loss of Severodonetsk as a town, the loss of Bakhmut didn't change the war. It didn't stop Ukraine being able to prosecute a defensive war in the way that they are doing, right? They are significant logistical hubs. They are significant towns for a bunch of reasons on an operational scale. But in terms of strategies, they are not strategic towns. And it's really important to understand that, to then understand why Kursk took place and why those troops weren't and material weren't sent elsewhere. And after you get to respond to that, I'll probably rewind and go through my let's start from square one and understand why Kursk was chosen.
I think so. I mean, I've had the impression for some time, and it's perhaps an unfashionable one, and that is that you've got two countries at war here, Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has the West on its side, but its allies are not providing what it needs in the right quantities in a timely fashion. And indeed, the ammunition famine has had a huge impact. Ukraine would have much more momentum, it had many more people, in fact, and soldiers if it hadn't been for that period. So what you've got is two sides that are essentially they're in a race to see who will crumble
Mm,
first. And there are different variables on each side determining how and in what way they crumble. But you haven't got two extraordinary superpowers. You've got one small country that is doing extraordinary things, but both are at risk of coming apart at the seams in various
mm,
different ways. Unfortunately, Ukraine's allies seem to be playing a game that sort of balances it so that Russia is not going to crumble first. I think we could, at various points, have supplied Ukraine to ensure that Russia was definitely, with the highest possible probability, the one that was going to crumble first. It might even have crumbled before now if Ukraine had got not just the munitions it needs, but also the permissions to use those munitions. And we're still in that point. We still seem to have a Western policy that is trying to balance these forces to prevent Russia from crumbling. And what Ukraine is doing here, I think, is saying, look, we're not going to play this game. We're going to speed things up to ensure that Russia crumbles first. I don't think that collapse, as it were, of the Russian ability to wage war will happen in Donetsk and the area there. Probably Ukraine would be the one to crumble first if it carried on with that attritional conventional warfare. But Ukraine is saying, no, we're going to try and push this thing further because what it does is put enormous pressure on Russia's political system, on Russia's political elite to mobilize. It puts huge pressure, making Putin look weak and forcing him to make decisions that he absolutely doesn't want to make. In my view, mobilizing the urban population, mobilizing more of the economy. If he does that, there are several risk points there. One is the additional pressure on the economy, another huge exodus of talent and educated people from the country rather than serving in the military. He breaks an unspoken contract with the urban elite that they will be free to live their lives and live their pleasures without having to dip their toes into the war. I think that all starts to come apart, and Ukraine knows it. They're playing a clever psycho political game here. Unfortunately, most of the media commentators and some of Ukraine's allies don't seem to get that.
Yeah, and I think we're recording this on the day after the night where Ukraine sent in 158 or more drones into Russia in the biggest wave of one-way attack drone attacks since the beginning of this war, or ever, actually, in the history of humanity. Okay, so that's really significant, and for a number of reasons. One is I think it's potentially escalatory. But to your point, Jonathan, you seem to be insinuating that, and I think I agree, that Ukraine are cognizant of the fact that, or the idea that if they send 160 odd drones into Russia and strike at these, you know, energy pieces of energy infrastructure and hydrocarbons infrastructure, if they do it on such a scale, and some of those are in Moscow city region and Moscow Oblast, then that could spur on the Russians to go, right, sod it, time to mobilize. And what you're saying is like that's actually, although you might think that's crazy because that's what it would allow Russia to win the war in terms of personnel against Ukraine, all other things remaining equal. The thing is that if they did mobilize, as you say, all other things wouldn't remain equal, and that could spell the end of Russia in political suicide, economic suicide, so on and so forth. And so, is it a game of Ukraine trying to bait Russia with such a big strike last night into acting in a way that it might look bad, but is actually good for Ukraine?
I think that's absolutely the case. I think they're also aware that Russia's war economy and indeed Russia's energy situation is far more precarious, of course, than the propagandists will let on and the statisticians, who are still unfortunately directly quoted by many. There are some great characters who are questioning this. Operator Starsky's done a fantastic piece in Times Radio and on other channels about the genius of Kursk and some of these aspects of it that may be the strategic reasons for it. Joe Bloggs, another fellow YouTuber, has done fantastic material, picking apart Russia's propaganda about its economy and shown how absolutely and incredibly fragile that is. We know Konstantin Samarlov does weekly episodes on the economy. And of course, the sort of source material that we all look at are people like Vladimir Milov, who's a former Russian economics minister. And they are all talking about essentially a tipping point, and that tipping point seems to be getting very, very close. Mobilization, as well as these energy strikes, could really sort of push that over the edge or prompt some kind of internal coup, because I think many people in the Russian elite are aware of how fragile this situation is, and they're fully aware that Putin is an escalation machine. He is not going to let up in any sense. He's not going to give in to any of this, but I think he's rapidly losing control of the situation. And that, of course, again, contributes to making him look weak. I think the Ukrainians are kind of aware of that. They're also perhaps aware of the forces on their side, which contribute to their fragility as well. That is the inability to really mass mobilize without damaging their own economy, wrecking their own economy. They don't want
Absolutely.
to. They don't want to prompt an exodus of bright young people from the country either, and that there's a real risk if they push mobilization too hard that will happen. But and there are many other pressures we know, including I'm sure they would love to sort of just say, screw these red lines. Let's use ATACMS to take out the airfields, which you'll have seen that story today, the appalling slaughter in Kharkiv, precisely because the US red lines are creating a zone of impunity for murder. They're creating a killing zone, enabling it, allowing it. It's a deeply immoral and deeply stupid policy.
Yeah, you get these memes that Jake Sullivan is the best air defense system that Russia presently owns, if you like. So, yeah, let's rewind a little bit to understand Kursk versus Pokrovsk then as a calculation for Ukraine. So the context here is the Ukrainians have attacked into Russia, into Kursk. They have taken more land in Kursk than the Russians have taken in Pokrovsk, but in Pokrovsk area, although it's a smaller scale, the Russians are advancing far, far more quickly at the moment, whereas Kursk has ground to a bit of a positional situation. The Pokrovsk area is quite precarious for the Ukrainians as they are ceding territory very quickly and giving up towns without too much of a fight. Okay, So that's the situation. So let's just go back to what Ukraine had to do. So Ukraine were in a position whereby they've been on defense for an awful long time, and the question is, do you sit on defense forever? No. So if your main objective at the top here is take back territory, which is no matter what, how they do it, whether it's politically or militarily, that's what they want to do. Ideally, they want 1991 borders, right? So that's your number one objective. But below that, there are going to be these other objectives, and below that, these other objectives and metrics of success. So the next objective down here, I think, is rest back initiative. And this is what I talked about with you the other day. So Ukraine need to get back the initiative so that they're not always reacting to Russia. Russia aren't dictating everything to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians get to dictate things to the Russians, and the Russians have to react, and they're the ones on the back foot. So how do you rest back initiative when you've got the front line as it is in Ukraine? So you could take all these troops that you've amassed and material that you've amassed and attack somewhere along the front line, or put those troops and material defensively into Pokrovsk to stop the attack of the Russians taking so much ground. But that's not resting back initiative. And then you have these other. So if you were going to attack, say in Kupiansk, for example, or across the Dnipro River, wherever, the problem is all of these areas are heavily fortified. They're covered in mines, and the Russians have got troops there that are battle-hardened troops all up and down the front lines. So wherever you attack with, no matter how many troops and material, rather like in Malatok Machka in 2000, in summer 2023, you will lose a lot of troops and materials. So the net below this kind of like take territory back to 1991 borders. Next objective below that is rest initiative in order to get that eventually. And then below that, you have these objectives or metrics of success, such are, and sorry to go on so long, but just let me explain this. So one is going to be not to lose your own troops. Two is not to lose your own material. Three is to degrade Russian troops. Four is to degrade Russian personnel. Material. Five is take logistical targets like in Kursk, Sudzha as a railway area, so on and so forth. You get all of these other objectives and take land and whatever that feed into this rest back initiative. So where could you attack along the front line that existed that you could do all of those things? And the answer is you can't. There was nowhere along the front line where you could do that. The only place you could do that would be attacking into Russia. You'd get surprise, you'd get conscripts and border guards, you'd get a lack of fortifications compared to the front line, a lack of minefields compared to the front line. You would not attrit as many of your troops as much as your material, and you would take a lot of prisoners and attrit them. And so therefore, Kursk or somewhere else along the Russian border is the only choice they had to do that. And before you can react to all of that, but the other thing is that attacking into Kursk gets them also strategic advantages that we'll talk about a bit later, and defending Pokrovsk, stopping them taking so much land in Pokrovsk, would not have changed the strategy of the war. It would have had operational impact only.
I think that's true, and I think we sort of what the media doesn't understand, as you say, they don't understand the strategic level, the tactical level, and so on. And I'm not a military person, but I have been talking to many who are and think strategically, and they've said, look, you lose territory, so is it better to lose territory in a controlled fashion where you can hold on to it so long as your losses are far lower than the enemy's, and the point at which your losses start to reach the same ratios, or not even the same ratios, but start to approach the ratios of the enemy, then it's no longer beneficial to hold it. A city, land per se, in a struggle like this for your existence, every piece of land cannot be viewed as holy. It has to be looked at as strategic. So if you're going to trick the enemy and then withdraw to a more fortified area, and if the enemy is stupid enough to think that gaining power over a pile of rubble is somehow important, and that they've paid tens of thousands of lives for that rubble, and they count that as a victory, well, more fool them. I think Ukrainians understand here that Russians have shown themselves ridiculously poor at maintaining logistics. So even if they were to push deeper into Ukraine, that simply creates more targets for HIMARS. That simply creates more targets for Ukraine to attrit. So Pokrovsk will go. The question is, will Ukraine be able to let it go in a way that significantly dents the Russians and doesn't hurt them quite as much. And I'm sure that is part of the calculus. And yet the media seem to get fixated on these cities, and each city, each village, each town is counted as a terrible blow to Ukraine. And yet the bigger picture is that Russia, with the way it's been fighting, the losses it's been sustaining, have really no chance of getting near Kiev. It would take hundreds of millions of troops at the current rate to
And
do
even
so.
taking Prokrovsk and Mirnorad, which is next to it, will be a real big challenge. Yes, they're taking an awful lot of land, or relatively more land than they were previously around Prokrovsk, but actually there's another step to have the troops and wherewithal to be able to take Prokrovsk. The other thing that's worth noting is that the other one other consideration for the Ukrainians is going to be, if we are going to fight somewhere with the Russians, let's fight in Russia, so that if we're flattened anywhere, and we can see what Russia are now presently doing to Sudzha, the aforementioned place, which is a railway, in a fairly important railway position in order to feed actually down into Ukraine. Now it's Russia that is flattening the towns in Russia in order to try and flush the Ukrainians out. Now, the Ukrainians had a choice of, do we attack the Russians in Ukraine and then watch them flatten our own towns, or do we attack into Kursk and watch Russia flatten their towns? Well, yeah, that's going to be the better option. So the question is, or I think the calculation is that taking more territory in Kursk is more beneficial than ceding territory in Pokrovsk region. It is bad there, and it's tough for those soldiers, but the bigger picture is the amount of land that they're losing there is still not as much as they gained in Kursk, and you don't get any strategic gains from defending Pokrovsk with more and more men. And as some analysts are saying, actually, it wasn't a man problem in Pokrovsk, it was a fortifications problem, and so on and so forth. The other thing to note that's super important is quite a lot of people are going and speaking to battalion commanders and troops on the ground in the Pokrovsk region. And of course, these people, even battalion commanders, aren't going to know the big picture. In fact, when you talk to squaddies on the ground, they don't often know what the next unit a few fields away is doing, right? They've got their own little world, and it's always going to be terrible because they're always in war. And this sounds horrible, but the reality is that you'll never have enough ammunition, you'll never have enough X, Y, and Z. Life will always suck, and you always want more and need more, and always feel like you need a rotation, and etc. etc. Now, they do need rotations, they do need more ammunition, etc. etc. But it is not that these people are going to necessarily understand why Pokrovsk is not being defended and Kursk is being attacked. That kind of calculation happens higher up the hierarchy, and when analysts and journalists go and speak to people, try and get an understanding from the people on the ground, you will get a skewed calculation from those people themselves.
Absolutely. And of course, the almost inbuilt assumption, and of course, if this assumption was correct, and I don't think it has been correct right from day one of the course, it has got an incursion. The assumption is that this is a raid, that it bears the character of other incursions which have been raids. You go in and you withdraw, you do a bit of reconnaissance, you do a bit of damage, and it's psychological, and you have minimal losses, and off you go. I think it was clear from day one that this was not a raid, that it had the character of something more permanent. And it would make no sense to send all those troops in there just for a couple of weeks and then
Yep.
withdraw them just to give Russia a bloody nose. So I did a video on day 2 of this incursion, I think it was, with Sergei Sumlini, and we were discussing this, and I was very forceful at that point. I said, this is not going to be just a raid. They're going to go in, they're going to hold this territory, they're going to use it as a toehold, maybe even a springboard for other incursions, for raids, for reconnaissance, possibly even allowing them to get closer to the Russian launch sites. And we know the key part of this strategy was trying to persuade the US to give them that permission finally, to show them that these red lines were imaginary. These red lines are in the cautious and timid national security advisor's head. They're not real, and Russia will not do anything about them. That is still ongoing, but I think that was a key part of it. We now learn, and it's no surprise, I think, to a couple of people on the channel and to myself, that along with the initial troops, Ukrainians had bulldozers, big JCBs, equipment to dig in and fortify immediately. My other speculation here is that you would not do this if you were just aiming to take a bit of land in Kursk. You would have a multi-stage approach. So we've seen some tentative incursions into Bryansk and Belgorod. I think they're potentially testing the waters about whether to go north, whether to go south, and they're not necessarily making it up as they go along, but they would have had, as Ben Hodges put it, a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, D, and E. They will have mapped out numerous scenarios and have a reasonably good idea what they're going to do. Here's the question I'm going to chuck back at you. They may well have expected far more resistance from Russia, and their plans may have included that. They may have expected a far more vigorous and organized response. It's now been 3 weeks, and despite Western analysts constantly speculating, well, Russia's really going to have a go now. Of course, this was great. Ukraine's done this, but they're going to incur the wrath of the great Russia. Well, we haven't seen anything really, apart from the FSB taking control of the operation, which tells you the operation is going to be one of probably terrorizing conscripts and terrorizing local residents rather than a robust military response. But what's your take on all that? And there's a whole lot of angles there I've thrown at you.
Well, actually, what I want to talk about is what the gains for the Ukrainians are from Kursk that could not have been achieved by putting those troops anywhere else on the front lines, particularly at Pokrovsk. So it seems to be that most people are going, you shouldn't have attacked into Kursk, you should have put those troops into Pokrovsk. Actually, they are putting some troops into Pokrovsk, is stabilizing some areas. So, and there are claims that they've got all these troops left over. They've got 4 to 6 brigades or 8 to 10 brigades. There are different claims about how many troops that Ukraine has got. Whether they are fully trained up, whether they're fully equipped is another question. And then some people are saying, well, the land is getting taken in Pokrovsk so quickly. Maybe this is a feint. Maybe it's some kind of trap to lure in the Russians. I don't know. But in terms of just Kursk versus Pokrovsk, it's important to note that only by attacking into Kursk have the Ukrainians been able to get the Russians to panic so much that they brought troops out from the Sahel region of Africa. So the Bear Brigade and other private military companies have been brought back. So when you're talking about strategic effect that would never have happened in Pokrovsk, you have got Russia to change a geopolitical strategy in another continent from attacking into Kursk. So that's something. The PR win for Ukraine, the morale boost that Kursk was that you wouldn't have got from just throwing defensive troops into Pokrovsk, has been huge. Like Kursk, for certainly for 3 weeks, was like massively cool. The Ukrainians were on a high from that, and that's hard to quantify, but it is really important. Likewise, on the flip side, the hit to PR in Russia and the embarrassment to the Kremlin for their own territory, like you said earlier, being attacked in a way that's reminiscent maybe of the 1940s or whatever, you have an incredibly embarrassing situation that never would have arisen had the Ukrainians plugged those troops into holes on the Pokrovsk front. And so you've then got logistics being affected inside Russia. You've got air defense systems being moved and other material having to be rushed into Kursk rather than being in position on the front line or elsewhere in Russia. You've got conscripts being rushed in. You've got people worrying about mobilization. You've got Russians saying, okay, we're setting up volunteer troops from your average Joes in Kursk. All these things are the effects of an incursion into Kursk you never would have got by plugging the holes in Pokrovsk. And so I think you need to see all of this and then also add in stuff like the waves of missiles and, well, hopefully it will be missiles, but at the moment, drone attacks onto hydrocarbon and energy infrastructure around occupied territories, but mainly into Russia, in the Rostov region, all these different oblasts. And you are starting to see a way that Ukraine is able to strategically affect Russia in quite an impressive way. So I think there's a lot to be said about Kursk that wouldn't have been able to be said about Pokrovsk.
think so. And I think we have to wait and see what Ukraine's got planned, where they're able to fortify, how much territory they are prepared to cede to Russia before they dig in to their defensive lines again. I think that would be highly strategic. I think there's also two interesting details that came out of video I watched earlier today that was put together by the Russian opposition journalist Michael Naki. And he made kind of two, I think, rather interesting points. And one is that people talk about the speed with which Russia is taking Pokrovsk. Well, Chasiv Yar hasn't fully been occupied yet, and that's been going on for many, 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 many
So,
weeks.
sorry to interrupt, but actually, Chazzy, so this game of military chicken, which is right, we've attacked into Kursk and we're hoping that Prokrovsk, Russian soldiers in Prokrovsk will be taken away. And the Russians are throwing everything into Prokrovsk, hoping that the Ukrainian soldiers will be taken from Kursk. So this is your military chicken. What the Kursk incursion has achieved is troops being taken away from the Zaporizhia front line, from the Chasiv Yar front line. So Chasiv Yar has not moved in a month, and that was a city that the Russians were. That was originally like the main objective for the Russian offensive phase, and actually it switched to other places. But Chasiv Yar has remained really with the Russians on the right hand side, on the eastern side of the Donbass Canal there, and that is a direct response of the Kursk incursion, as is the Russians failing to get any further in Kharkiv. So they've drawn troops from these other areas. They just haven't drawn it from the areas they're having the most success, Pokrovsk, and actually down to Vuhledar, I think is a bit of a worry, all that like southeastern area. But anyway, sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, and of course, Vuhledar is being reduced down to a pile of rubble. I mean, when they fully take that, there's going to be nothing there really left of any kind of economic or strategic use. Another point that Michael Naki made is that earlier in the war, when Russia clearly had more resource, they could push on multiple fronts at the same time. They could mount attacks in numerous locations, and they could mount a major assault like the one in Prokhovsk in several locations at a time. It seems now that they are attrited to such a degree that they can only mount one of these operations at any one time. And that talks to what you just said there, is that if they're pushing in Pokrovsk, they can no longer push in Chasiv Yar, they can no longer push in other directions. So we are, I think, seeing Russia being bled out, sort of literally and figuratively. And their
The problem is that's
capacity
for both
is slower.
sides, though. That is for both sides, though. So the flip side is so we are seeing that the Russians are not attacking with 30 vehicles at a time like they did maybe 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, or 60 vehicles at a time. Now, the most like we saw 16 vehicles attack, I think, yesterday, and 14 of them were taken out in the Pokrovsk area or maybe south of there. So those are your large scale attacks. It's more normally 5 or 3, and the Russians are unable to do that to the degree they used to be, and that is, as you say, only in sort of certain places, not all over the front line as it was at some point. But we also must remember that as the Russians are being degraded, the Ukrainians are being degraded as well. The good thing is the Ukrainians are getting replacement vehicles that are better than the ones they had, whereas the Russians are not. So that degradation is asymmetrical, and also the Russian, they're both. The Russians are losing more than the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians can afford to lose fewer. So they're like, it started like this, and they're both going down, but that there's still a big gap, and it's still really tough for the Ukrainians.
I think the other calculation here, and this is the bit that's a gamble, of course. If you're going to carry on that attritional war, and let's say, of course, didn't happen. If you're going to carry on that attritional war, the best you can hope for as an outcome to the war is a stalemate. And if someone like Trump gets in, then you know that that's exactly what's going to be sort of forced on you. The best you can get is a stalemate. Will you get your prisoners back? Maybe you'll get some of them, not all of them. Will you get the kidnapped children back? Probably not. Will you get reparations? Probably not. Will you get a stable and consistent country and a stable economy that's going to really encourage people to come back from abroad, all those displaced people? Are you going to get the huge influx of rebuilding money into a country that is still carved up, whose borders are still uncertain? You're not going to get anything that actually feels like a victory. And I think Kursk could be a gamble, and what comes after Kursk could be even more dramatic. Probably shouldn't even speculate about what could come next. But I think this is a gamble that Ukraine figures this is the only possible way they might actually attain something that feels like a genuine victory, because this is the kind of move that could force the Russian regime to collapse. If the regime collapses, the army collapses. If Putin's deposed or there's a coup in Moscow, is the army going to carry on fighting if there are no orders coming from Moscow? Well, if Zelensky was gone, then Ukrainians would carry on and they'd find a new leader. And I don't think they'd be, descend into internecine kind of banditry. They would carry on because their fight is for their survival. If Moscow falls, it's like one of those sci-fi movies. You'll see the Russian army, I think, collapse if they're not getting their orders from the top of the vertical pyramid. It's kind of game over. And I think this is the gamble. This is the throw of the dice,
There
which
are
Ukraine
some
has done.
Yeah, there are some Ukrainian, I think, I don't know, it was a military person that sort of, I don't know if it's a leak or whatever, but the claim was that this part of the reason for the Kursk incursion was Sersky wanting a victory. Now, I guess you could interpret that in several ways, like just a little morale victory, this little kind of like, yeah, look what we've done, yeah, that keeps me in my job type thing. Or like a victory in a larger way that you're talking about, that it could be a domino involved in this larger, more careful game of of this longer form military chess where you can see the moves forming into potentially a checkmate or something at the end. But I don't know. It is a high risk strategy, but high risk, high reward, rather than, I guess, plugging all your troops into cross in a defensive maneuver would be low risk, no, low reward. And that's the difference. I think that's probably a good way of interpreting the difference between those two maneuvers.
I
Well,
think it's
actually,
yeah.
interestingly, that one is a maneuver and one isn't. So that's the other point to make, is that Kursk allows maneuver warfare, and putting your troops anywhere else on the front line, it only allows positional warfare. So that's also something to take into account.
And of course, the Russians have shown that they are not as adept at maneuver warfare. I won't say they're not, totally incapable of it, but they certainly are not geared up to it. And their army has been, they might have the same names of various divisions and battalions and so on, but they've been attrited to such a degree that you're looking at the sort of second, third generation of soldiers. They've recycled, all the guys who were considered professional at the start of the invasion, all those who were in some ways feared and respected by some of the Ukrainians, all those are gone. And in
Yeah,
fact, they're
so
probably on the third generation of them by now.
yeah, so take for example 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, which is a Marines brigade. I think that's the number. They were originally down in Vuhledar, and they got reconstituted. Some people say as many as 9 times. Right. What used to happen with elite forces in say peacetime is you would have your elite forces and they would go to your conventional units and take the cream off those who are already trained and say, we're going to take them and then we're going to turn them into the elite, right? What happened at the beginning of the war fairly quickly is that those elite units were being used, instead of being used for like crack maneuvers or whatever, they were being used as your kind of squaddies, grunts or whatever. That's a bit pejorative, but your general infantrymen on the front lines, and they were being attrited, used incorrectly, then attrited, and then you have this forced dilution whereby you are, as you say, having to reconstitute them. But where do you get these new ones from? You're not going to the other units and taking the cream of their units and saying, right, you are elite troops. They were just reconstituting them with conscripts and or volunteers originally and mobilized, but these were not like quality troops. And nowadays I think most of the elite units are far from being elite, if they are at all.
I think that's the case. And if you've got the vertical structure still in place, which you have, then it's difficult to actually train up this new generation. It's not a system that really encourages innovation, and I would imagine it stifles proper learning mechanisms as well. In this context, let's touch on this other potential objective before we sort of probably approach the last couple of questions. But let's tackle this appeasement management, as I think it clearly is at this point. I mean, these attacks in Kharkiv are horrific today, absolutely horrific. Not a surprise from Russia, of course, that the attack in broad daylight, the attack a sports center.
Vengeance.
It's vengeance. It's pure vengeance and malice. Um, it's done in broad daylight. It's done at the weekend. It's done at a location where they would have known there's the greatest concentration of civilians and families. It's no accident that that was chosen. Preventing Ukraine from striking the launch sites of the Shaheeds, the launch sites of the drones, the airfields. These are all absolutely legitimate military targets in any other war in history. These limitations, I don't think, have existed in any battlefield, in any military scenario, anywhere in history, and certainly they are not necessarily in order to, conform with the sort of laws of war. Ukraine is absolutely within its right to hit every one of those sites. The only restriction here is that those weapons come from the US, and the US has prevented their use for that purpose. And they've prevented other allies like Britain, who seem perfectly comfortable for Storm Shadow to be used in that capacity. They've prevented allies from using their munitions that they've donated in that way. And unfortunately, we are showing deference to the Americans in that respect. We're not pushing them too hard. We are going for the sort of diplomatic united front, etc. It is immoral, and it is enabling the most evil acts of murder.
Yeah, so we all know that, well, most of us would agree at the moment that red lines have been crossed and nothing's happened. And most of us are fairly confident that if Ukraine used ATACMS to attack airfields within 200, 300 kilometers, then nothing would happen. But the overly cautious approach of the Biden administration, with particularly Jake Sullivan, and I don't know whether he's a scapegoat or whether he is the mastermind of anti-escalation appeasement, has meant that that's really frustrating because we are confident that nothing would happen. Now, they could take it. I was reading someone saying today they could take a leaf out, like the Kursk incursion. What's interesting about the Kursk incursion is that not only did the Ukrainians surprise the Russians, and they did that by amassing troops, and they kept saying that, oh, look at all the troops that the Russians have amassed in Kursk themselves. We think they're going to attack into Sumy, and that gave the Ukrainians the cover to amass their own troops and materiel, and pretending that these were defensive, and of course they weren't. And then they attacked up into Kursk. But they didn't ask the US permission, and they didn't let the US know about this. So it was a surprise to the US, and the US had to then post hoc rationalize or post hoc agree with that course of action. So they were like, oh yeah, no, we don't have a problem with them attacking into Kursk. Yeah, we didn't know anything about it, but it's cool by us. So some people are saying today that why don't the Ukrainians just get all their ATACMS and Storm Shadows that they've got left at the moment and absolutely hammer those airfields they keep asking to hammer? They've given the US a list of targets. They did that formally the other day in this meeting between UK, US, France, and Germany for defense security councils and ministers and whatever. They've handed that over to the Americans, saying, look, this is what we want to hit. Why won't you let us hit them? What if they actually just launched everything they could right now, took them out, high risk but potentially high reward, take them out, and then see what the Americans say? Would they go, oh yeah, we don't have a problem with that? Or will the Americans literally go, right, that's it, we're not helping you at all anymore? Because of course, if they do that, then all their strategic objectives, the Americans' strategic objectives for wanting to support Ukraine, will be thrown out the window. So Ukrainians could be pretty ballsy and actually do it and go, you're okay with that, right? Good.
Here's the interesting thing. US interest in the Ukraine war has been waning for a long time. US support for Ukraine has been slowly but surely dipping down, not just on the GOP side, but on the Democrat side, as they've perceived this to be a war of stalemate and attrition with no victory in sight. Interest and support has waned. Kursk has turned that around dramatically. Americans actually love winners. The Democrats might not like winners, but the American public, on the whole, they like ballsy moves. They like winners. They like innovation. They like something that has energy. I think if Ukraine did what you've just said, there would be an uptick, a huge uptick in support by, broadly speaking, the American public. What kind of US administration would turn around and go, actually, we don't agree with all these people who are going to go to the polls in November, by the way. No, you're all completely wrong. We believe in defeat, not victory. I think it could go in Ukraine's favor.
Yeah, and actually, I forgot to mention when I was listing these strategic or even like political ramifications of attacking into Kursk rather than putting those soldiers and material into Pokrovsk defensively. Kursk succeeded in grabbing the newspaper headlines again in a way that shoving those troops into Pokrovsk never would have done. And suddenly Kursk put Ukraine back on the news agenda. We were seeing it on TV. We started seeing like Sky News military analysis of with the maps up again and getting people like Michael Clark in. And on CNN, you had them up with their interactive boards. Like that wasn't happening. Kursk then brought it back, and that that is a success for the Ukrainians that again is quite hard to kind of quantify, but it is incredibly important. Ukraine need to make sure that people are caring enough about them to have that pressure on from the public to the politicians to keep getting the aid and support that they so desperately need.
This is it. Well, I think we'll have plenty to talk about the next time. We haven't talked about Belarus yet. There's interesting things kind of going on there as well. Of course, there are other cards in Putin's fragile house of cards that are starting to wobble. I think we could see some absolutely fascinating things happening over the next couple of weeks and months. And of course, we have to remember that Ukraine is paying a terrible price. As interesting as these things are, as bold as their strategy is, they're trying to save their own people's lives because the
And
price
it's
they're paying
terrible
is.
for those troops in Pokrovsk. There's a place on the Dnipro River called Krinky where the Ukrainians tried to get a bridgehead across the river and they kind of failed, but they kept about 300 troops there. And the reason they kept them there, as far as I can work out, is that it was attracting the Russians into there with personnel and materiel. And that allowed Magyar's birds and these other drone units and artillery to hammer the crap out of these Russian forces. And it attrited hundreds and hundreds of pieces of kit and huge numbers of personnel. And so those troops were effectively being used as sacrificial lambs in order to do the job of attracting the Russians to destroy all that Russian equipment. Now, you speak to those people, that sucks, right? Why are we here? What are we doing on the other side of the river? This is all hopeless. It's suicide. And in a sense, yeah, it was kind of suicidal, but actually it was for the greater good. And so you speak to the people in Pokrovsk, it's terrible, right? Pokrovsk is horrible. They're losing territory, they're losing men, they're losing equipment. But if there's a calculation whereby, yeah, that is for the greater good and the all these other chess pieces are moving, then you can justify that as long as that is actually the case going on there. And it is tough for the Ukrainians. They do need, I mean, this is a relatively, and I'll finish on this because I know that you were trying to wrap it up and there's me going off again. But like, it's a relatively easy war to win. And I've said this right from the beginning of the war. Ukraine just need more stuff. Like all they need to do is mobilize. All we need to do is give them money and stuff. Money and stuff. You get the boots on the ground. You sort that out. We'll sort this out, and you win this war against Russia because we'll
And not
also
tie
do.
their hands, Jonathan, and not tie their hands behind. No, they're fighting with one arm behind their back.
And we'll fight you economically, Russia, and politically. So you're a pariah nation. You're suffering in sanctions. We've seen Russia revert to gold to pay China, as that's what we hear today, because the secondary sanctions are stopping Chinese banks from doing business with Russia. Now that's brilliant. So all of these things come together, and Russia should lose this war, but we're still so tentative in what we give. We should just be absolutely piling in on Ukraine, but alas, it's not quite the case.
I think you're right. I think this will come as a shock to many Western analysts and the media, but Putin still believes he's winning. It's not rational to our minds. The evidence we see tell us that this cannot be the case, that he cannot think and feel that, given how much of his country's wealth he's wasted, how much of his resources, how much of their international status. Putin probably still believes he can win because we have not forcefully made the case that he cannot win. And I think that is on us, not on the Ukrainians. And we also, one final point there, which I think is important to remember, Russia are not just throwing everything in terms of materiel, they're tearing up the rule book down in Pokrovsk. There are numerous cases being recorded of the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian troops. Russia will stop at nothing if we don't stop them.
Yep, true. Yeah, and it's within our power to fairly easily do so. The amount of material that, say, the US, and I don't always want to talk about how it's incumbent on the US to do stuff, but they are the ones that are spending 12, more than the next 12 nations combined in terms of defense spending. They are the ones with whole deserts full of like Bradleys and Abrams and so on and so forth. They're the ones that can really help. And you go, all in or not. And at the moment, they are somewhat in. And I think the US elections is possibly, so one of my theories is that they are thinking, well, if the US election goes to Trump, then this might be the last military aid package, the 60 billion one, which is only 25 billion worth of actual military kit. Now, if Trump gets in, there's no more. So we need to eke this out for as long as possible rather than give them a load now and then get another appropriations bill sorted. So there are all these, and so you can possibly understand why the US aren't all in, but it's damn frustrating because we all think they should be all in. And yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to come back to this, unfortunately, because I don't see them changing that policy in the coming hours and days. So we will be revisiting this, I'm sure, and we'll be getting more and more voices to try and make these calls as vociferously as possible. But Jonathan, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me on this Sunday evening, late in the UK. But I think yes, important to get this stuff recorded and to keep sharing these strident views with the audience.
Always a pleasure to speak to you, Jonathan.